Hello, and welcome to What Decision Research Tells Us About How Buyers Analyze Choices. I'm Tom Swanson, Engagement Manager with Heinz Marketing, and I'm just so excited to talk about this because businesses need to make decisions, and they rely on people to do it. We might have all the data in the world, but decision making follows many of the same concepts today that it has for centuries. So let's dive into what decision research can tell us about how buyers analyze and make choices. First off, before we go any further, these are the three articles I referenced for this video. I'll link them in the description so you can easily find them, but they're all available on scholar.google.com. Just search for them or the citations here. They're all free. We're only going to scratch the surface of what's in them. So if this interests you, I really encourage you to check them out. It's a lot of fun. This is Professor Scott Galloway from NYU. In one of his No Mercy, No Malice newsletters, he said, quote, "Rookie marketers make the mistake of thinking choice is a good thing. Choice is a tax on your time and attention. Consumers don't want more choice, but more confidence in the choices presented," end quote. And this is true in B2B as well. How many times have you been overwhelmed by too many choices when what you really want is to know you're making the right one? So what gives people confidence in choices? There are a lot of models in decision making that can help us illuminate this, but we're going to look at three that have been heavily researched. And one quick note before I go forward: the studies that I reviewed for this are mostly to do with decision making as an evolutionary tactic, which means the primary goal of subjects making decisions is to reproduce and proliferate, success in which would indicate evolutionary fitness. At an organizational level, you could make the argument that this is the case as well. Maybe not reproduction, but certainly market proliferation and growth. Biology just provides such a great window in the business. But anyway, let's get into it. First up, we have true rationality, and we're only going to spend a little bit of time on this because it doesn't really happen. However, for the sake of conversation, true rationality, or unbounded rationality, assumes that humans will consider all of the alternatives and make a decision that is the best option. Of course, the problem with this is that nobody's that galaxy brained. The true rationality is beyond the scope of most humans' computational capacity. When you're learning econ early, you hear the assumption that decision makers are rational and will make rational decisions, and this is true to a point, but nobody can evaluate every option, and doing so would eventually produce diminishing returns. True rationality, sadly, is a myth. Helpful for straw man arguments, but not really applicable to the real world. Nobody has that kind of computational power just sitting in their skulls. So next we come to bounded rationality, which we'll explore more in a moment. This is going to come up a few times, but for now, we'll suffice to say that it's a more human look at what rationality means. That is, it takes into account the boundaries that a human being typically has. Finally, we have deep rationality, which is the idea that our concept of what rationality means is rooted in our evolutionary history. It suggests that human decision-making is geared to solve problems that have come up again and again throughout our existence, and then applying that same logic to different domains. For example, it's very common to be afraid of spiders and snakes, but not of cars, despite the fact that cars are far more worthy of paralyzing fears than spiders and snakes combined times 10. We're pretty confident as a species that spiders and snakes are icky, but the cars are really cool. Researchers suggest that in ancient times, a bite from a spider or a snake may well have proved fatal. So those that had the fear of these were more likely to procreate. Cars have existed for only around a century and not even close enough to make an evolutionary impact. Maybe another few millennia of careless driving will ingrain a stronger fear of high-speed metal death machines in us, but who knows, especially with self-driving cars. This is the Adaptive Toolbox, so just to move on. You might recognize that name from earlier. It's the focus of one of the articles. The concept is pretty simple. It defines bounded rationality, in which we discussed a moment ago, as requiring both satisficing and the use of fast and frugal heuristics. The idea here is that decision makers act on past experiences and biases, and they're also likely to take a good enough approach than to consider every option. Humans and even teams of humans just don't have the computational capacity, let alone time, to consider every option at equal weight. And even if they did, it would take so long that the returns on the decision would begin to erode due to lost time. At some point, you just have to plug your nose and jump. And of course, unbounded rationality and optimization under constraints leads to what the writer called demons. It's a pretty snarky article. I recommend you check it out. But I want to talk about optimization under constraint because it actually sounds pretty reasonable. Optimization is an attempt to reach the maximum value of a function, whether it's a buying decision, an email campaign, or a technology budget. You want the maximum benefit for the minimum cost. However, effective optimization is enormously expensive for our brains. We can optimize things when we have a clear understanding of the data and the impacts, or assumed understanding anyway. But when things get obscure, the computational cost of optimization grows exponentially. And obscurity is where most B2B buyers exist. Your typical B2B buyer has so many unknowns that making optimizations is immensely expensive, particularly in decisions. There are unforeseeable impacts, competing goals, unclear cues, and a mind-boggling number of alternatives. There just is too much going on for marketers to assume that B2B buyers are making decisions using optimization strategies. And the other downside is that we assume an optimal stopping point can be calculated when in reality, optimization under constraints often results in analysis paralysis. Knowing when the cost of stopping the search outweighs the value of continuing can be even more computationally expensive than the decision itself, and so people stall. Optimization often is not a viable strategy for decision making. Companies publish huge amounts of content to help buyers optimize their decisions, and while blasting that information onto the web is great for awareness, it isn't always as effective in building confidence, and thus it doesn't close deals. Yet great decisions are made every day. Going back to the adaptive toolbox, solutions have to be good enough, and that's sufficing, and buyers are most likely to make decisions based on heuristic reasoning. So let's dive into how that works to get a real look at how people make decisions. There are 3 concepts for bounded rationality that we need to know, and they're pretty simple. Each concept is super important, though, so we're going to go into each individually. First, psychological plausibility. The decision process that we have in mind has to be plausible for a species to carry out. This is important because we think we kind of know how people think, but if we were to study the decision making of ants, it would be far more challenging. And if you think of a company as a living, breathing organism, it starts to make sense how we would apply this. We need to know how companies and teams think to know if our understanding of how they make decisions is a plausible one. The next is domain specificity, which suggests that heuristics apply largely to discrete domains in which decisions are made and don't always transfer from one to the other. There are plenty of counterpoints here around how heuristics can apply across domains, and there are some that do. But for business, we can assume that there's some truth to this, particularly because heuristics that work in marketing are unlikely to be as effective in finance, and you could really plug and play any number of departments into that. Finally, ecological rationality is the concept that the degrees of success that these domain-specific heuristics enjoy is more of a factor of how well they are adapted to the ecosystem in which they are made than any optimization strategy or even consistency of application. If it doesn't work in a market, it's not ecologically rational. So now that we've talked through these 3, let's take a look at how they apply to some of the concepts in decision making. For example, risk. Understanding how buyers think about risk is crucial to messaging. We often consider objections and how to get around them, but these objections are clear signals for how buyers are thinking about risk. Prospect theory, which is one of the articles I mentioned before, expands upon how people tend to place a higher weight on a potential loss than a potential gain of a similar magnitude, despite the net result being the same on average. The heuristic here is that the pain of loss in business is often greater than the joys of success. When you're dealing with objections, where is the loss that your buyers are considering? It generally comes down to profitability, but there are avenues there, things like time, skill, people, budget, reputation. Whatever the case, messaging too hard to the upsides without mitigating the downsides is going to fail. And to really create confidence in your buyers, you need to understand and consider the ecology that they live in and know what rational risk mitigation looks like within that marketplace. Some domains, for example, are more tolerant of risks or attract people with a higher risk tolerance. You need to understand this about your buyers in order to message effectively to them. I love talking about marginal utility, and we've talked about diminishing returns from an optimization perspective. But what about marginal value as of a message? How much value does the 20th piece of content create with the same message when decisions are based largely on heuristic reasoning and trusted peers? If we call back to Professor Galloway's quote, more choices are not always the right answer, and oftentimes neither is more content. Buyers want confidence that their decision will help them and their firm, and the product and problem information isn't always going to do it, especially when they've already consumed so much as they probably have when they're lower in the funnel. Good customer research will identify where confidence comes from in your best accounts, and understanding what heuristics they're applying and the marketplace itself will help you know what to message. Do you think most people choose a higher reward in the future or a lower one immediately? Well, surprise, it's complicated. The concept is called temporal versus profitability discounting. Which do you discount more, reward or time? Companies and individuals often think very differently about this. And there are all kinds of factors that might impact how a company might respond to the question, including growth stage, time of year, market disruption, investment rounds, all kinds of stuff. Knowing the big 3 for your buyers is a huge part of this. What domain-specific heuristics are at play in this weight? And what is the market ecosystem like? Is your understanding of how they think plausible enough that you can apply it to how they would make this decision? Because it is going to impact whether or not they choose your product. Finally, we have indifference curves. You should recognize these if you've ever taken an economics class. Indifference curves show how people weigh the value of 2 separate goods or outcomes against budget constraints. Well, the budget constraint one does anyway. The deep rationality perspective suggests that the weight of that value is highly dependent on the social environments, or in the case of companies, market environments, on the ecological rationality of the decision. A good example is that if you are in a market whose buyers prefer sustainable solutions, then sustainable initiatives get weighted higher for investment. And it's pretty straightforward stuff, but it requires you to understand again how those big three apply to your buyers. So know them well. As you could probably tell at the end of the day, and now at the end of this video, these are the three biggest takeaways. You need to understand each of these three things about your buyers and their companies in order to get a grip on how they make decisions. For psychological plausibility, how do the company, buying committee, and personas think? What is psychologically plausible for them given where they exist? Within their domain, what heuristics exist? How do they think about risk? What about budget? Where do these heuristics come from? Are they being generated by peers? Are they coming from journals and articles? Are they coming from thought leaders? Who knows? You should. What is the ecosystem in which they exist, aka the market? And what is rational in that space? You need to understand your buyer's marketplace and how people make decisions within it, because it's likely that your buyers are making decisions the same way. As you can probably tell, I love talking about applied psych and marketing. So please reach out to me with any questions. I have included my email address here. I'll be on the lookout. Thank you so much for watching. And then I will need to